welcome everybody. And I'm very happy to be here with both Mitch Frumkin and Ed Guttenplan to be able to present this important program to you. Let me start just by introducing the participants in this. And probably many of you know the folks who are on this program, but nonetheless, for those who don't, let me start with Ed Guttenplan, who is going to be our first speaker after I just do a little brief background. Ed co-founded Wilkin & Guttenplan in 1983. He's the managing shareholder, and he handles all strategy, personnel, and financial aspects of the Wilkin & Guttenplan firm. Ed provides a wide array of accounting, tax, and litigation support and business advisory services to developers, condos, and HOAs. And he's the past president of the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and he's a member of CAI's Hall of Fame. Mitch Frumkin is president of KIPCON Inc. He's a professional engineer. It is a professional consulting engineering firm. Mitch is a licensed engineer in multiple states and is a reserve specialist. He's a past national president of CAI. He chaired the task force that created both the National Reserve Study Standards. He co-authored the book Reserve Funds, How and Why Community Associations Invest Assets, as well as the nationally published Best Practices paper on reserves. So I'm very proud to be participating with both of these guys. For those of you who know them, you also know they're great guys. They're extremely knowledgeable in their field, and they're some of the top people in the country who work on these issues. I also want to mention that this was also participated in by the New Jersey Builders Association and the Community Associations Institute. And I want to just mention the people who participated in the task force that resulted in these regulations. So on the New Jersey Builders Association side, in addition to the people that we've already talked about, we had Grant Lucking, we had Steve Brumfield with Toll Brothers, we had Corey Wesco with Pulte, we had John Cornelia with KHOV, and we had Barbara Casey, who routinely does PRED registrations on behalf of developers. On the CAI side, in addition to myself, we had Mike Pesci with Associa, Barbara Drummond with Prime Management, Lauren Lightman with Hill Wallach, and Larry Thomas, who was then the CED of CAI and is now with Taylor Management Company. So we had a great group of people who went through this process. Steve, are you there?
Dave, can you hear me?
We can.
I was thrilled to be a part of the task force. My experience with it, it comes from two places. Number one, I'm what I like to refer to as a recovering community association manager, and also now working for a developer for the last 15 years or so on and off. So I happen to know a lot of folks like yourself on sort of both sides of the aisle who do a fantastic job in your respective work and have similar interests. Our interest is to obviously make money and protect our shareholders as a company, but we also want satisfied customers. And so all of this goes in part to having satisfied customers and building and creating great community associations, which we're very proud of. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to work with yourself and Mitch and Ed and everyone else that you mentioned in the process of creating great community associations.
Well, thanks for that, Steve, and thanks for your participation because you were an important element to getting this all done. So thank you. What we're talking about today are new DCA proposed regulations concerning developer budgets, payments, working capital, and reserves. It's been 30 plus years that we've had these regulations in place, and we were dealing with some of the issues that come up. So let me just talk about that by way of background. So the question is, why now? Why are we going through this major change? Well, there's several areas that the existing regulations created significant problems in. The first was what we all refer to as benefits derived. And I put a piece of the regulations that exist today, not the new ones, but exist today. And paragraph B is the one that has been a source of great aggravation among both community associations and developers. And clearly what it says is that once the association has made a common expense assessment, the assessment shall be assessed against the units individually owned and under development in proportion to the benefit derived by the unit from the items included in the budget. Well, this has always been interpreted to mean that since it included items that were under development or construction that was under development, it meant the developer had to contribute in some proportion. Of course, the question is, what proportion? The other regulation that created significant issues was the one dealing with adequate reserves. And again, I've just put up a small part of the regulations that deal with this. And what it says is that when the developer prepares the budget for the association, for the project the developer is doing, it has to prepare an operating budget which shall provide for any and all common expenses to be incurred during the year, as well as adequate reserves. So the language is simple, but the execution is not so simple. So these issues have created endless negotiation and litigation. And both the builders and CAI felt as if we could do better. We could come up with a better proposal that better defined these areas. What benefit did the developer derive from the budget as it was developing the project? What is an adequate reserve? What does the word adequate mean? The current regulations provide for a full occupancy budget. Well, when you have a large project, 500 or more units, that may be built out over numerous years, depending on the market. And the question always becomes, well, does that full occupancy budget really mean anything? Is it really predictive of what you're going to be paying as a member of the association? And the answer in large part is no, it's not really predictive of what you're actually going to be paying. And by the time you get to the end of the project, when there is full occupancy, that budget is so out of date as to be almost meaningless. Then you have capital contributions, those amount that the developer collects for the association from each purchaser as they buy a unit. And that, what happens to that money? What can the developer use that money for? And that was often an issue of great debate. Should that money all be there when the developer turns over control of the association? Or is that money usable by the association during the time that the developer controls that board? Okay. Next. So when the Community Associations Institute and the builders came together, realizing that it would be a benefit to both of our memberships to have these issues resolved, we discussed the methods, how to get this done. And it's not an easy process because, as you might imagine, there's very clear views on both sides about how this should be interpreted. But at the end of the day, after any number of meetings and quite a bit of drafting of proposed regulations, we discussed the methods of resolving these, and we agreed 90% of the way. I mean, there were a couple of issues that we still had kind of open that we went to the DCA with and let them make the final decision, but those were very minor. I have to say on the CAI side that we appreciated the fact that we had rational, reasonable people all around the room to deal with these issues, that there was give and take. And, there must have been 3 or 4 meetings over a 6-month or so period of time as drafts were shared and discussions were had, and we really went deeply into each of these issues. Ultimately, we presented this to the Department of Community Affairs, and we met with the department, who of course had their own ideas about some of these issues, but largely the DCA bought into the concepts that we both presented. So The DCA agreed to pursue these new regulations. And by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with the regulatory process, this isn't the usual way it's done. The usual way it's done is the administrative agency simply comes up with what it thinks is the best for the regulations. And it essentially, doesn't ask for input from the regulated industry. Well, this time it did allow that participation by the regulated industry. And we ended up coming to full agreement on all of the issues. And then DCA said to us, but understand, there is a 6-step process that we go through that those of us who are sitting at this table can't control. First of all, we'll produce through what you've given us initial regulations. The DCA staff reviews those and recommends revisions. It then goes to the commissioner's office for review and comment. It then goes to the governor's office for review and comment. And then it comes back for redrafting based upon any comments made by the commissioner's office or the governor's office. And then the proposed new regulations are published for public comment. Interestingly enough, when the DCA did publish these proposed regulations, it made an interesting statement in the proposal. And it's on the screen. And what it was basically acknowledging was that the department, the Builders Association, and the Community Associations Institute worked together on these. And I think what they say is the purpose of these amendments is as well as any of us can say it. So it said that the purpose of these amendments is to codify requirements based on current policy and to ensure budgets are developed, common expense assessments are levied, and association monies are properly segregated, managed, and utilized in an identifiable and transparent manner. In addition, the proposed amendments specifically allow collection of a working capital contribution from a new member at closing as a means of funding the startup costs of the association. So the proposed regulations were issued on June 15th, 2020. The public comment period closes on August 15th, 2020. And our goal today is to take you through, we showed you 2 paragraphs that we started with. The regulations are a paradigm shift. They are saying, in order for us to clarify what the obligations of both the developer and associations are going forward, requires a lot more detail. Now, up front, there's no question this is going to require a pretty fair amount of work. So we want to go through for you what that entails, what are the new requirements, so that as we go through this, you can start thinking about how you will deal with these issues as time goes by. Now, when will the final regulations be published? Well, it's hard to say. We started this process over a year ago. We started it, I think, in late 2018. And DCA went and said, all right, we're ready to go to regulations. They were literally putting pressure on us to say, we've got instructions from above. This has got to get done. We said, great, glad it's done. It's almost a year later by the time the proposed regulations were published. Now, do I expect the final regulations to take a year? I do not, but I would not be surprised if it took anywhere from, say, 4 to 6 months to see the final regulations, depending on the number of comments received, et cetera. But I will say this on behalf of DCA. They did a marvelous job in adopting what was the agreed upon solution to this problem. So hopefully both the community association side and the builder side will be pleased with how it turned out. Even if it requires more upfront work, it is going to result in a significant reduction in the amount of dispute and argument that's necessary in the future. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ed Guttenplan.
I'm really pleased that this whole process took place because for some of us, we've been saying, at least for me, it's been 38 years since 38 years we've been begging for some kind of clarification here. And fortunately now we have it. So I'm going to try to go through some of the regulations. I just want to first point out, and I think this first section Dave alluded to about the assessment shall be assessed against the units individually owned under development in proportion to the benefit derived by the unit from the items included in the budget. And there is a whole lot of lack of clarity in those words. And as I've gone through this over the years, there have been, and I've done it on both sides and analyzed it on both sides, and there are professionals who will just put together the most extreme case, whether or not it's intellectually honest or reflects reality. And they could have a developer funding a deficit and then ask for more in the way of full assessments on paper units, I'll call it, leading to huge windfalls for the association. And I think sometimes that's for negotiating position. On the other hand, associations needed to be protected from those developers who did what they could to minimize their contribution to the association, delay payments, create inadequate budgets that don't support the ongoing operations of the association. So there's both sides that will benefit from the clarity that these regulations bring. And I just want to tell you, some of you'll see the variety of formulas that are now being used that I've seen, where the developer's responsibility is a formula in the documents. And you should know it doesn't matter what the document says, it matters what the PRED says, because those regulations supersede what's ever in the documents. Developers have subsidized deficits, they've paid full fees on all units, they've paid fees on units under construction, they've paid full fees on units in a building where the first unit in that building got a CO. They allocate based upon the budget. Do you base the allocation based upon the budget, as is in the wording in the current regulations, or is it really intended to be based upon actual expenses? Because not everything in the budget actually takes place, and what are we really trying to accomplish? Reserves budgeted or as budgeted or when constructed and put in place. And construction issues with reserves, like when does it start if the roads have not been top coated? I'll leave the tough reserve questions to Mitch. He will cover all of the budgetary issues related to the reserves. So the proposed regulations, this is what they call for. Here is the clarified formula. It's full fees on all units that have been registered. So there's no lack of clarity here. It's if the units are registered, whether occupied, unbuilt, or built, there are full fees on all the units that have been registered. If deficit funding is chosen, then all units are subject to their share. So there's an equality between the developer units and the owner units. If the developer subsidizes the monthly fee of the unit owners, it must clearly be disclosed as a special notice in the public offering statement. What this is saying is, and common, the developer will do a full occupancy budget, and that number will be the lowest number that will possibly occur in the association because you have the maximum units and everything is built. But in the first phase, if you happen to put the clubhouse in the first phase and build all of the infrastructure, the actual costs in the first year are much higher per unit than they would be at full occupancy. Nonetheless, the developer says, we're only going to charge you the full occupancy fee and we'll make up the difference. So here what they're saying is, if the developer subsidizes the common expenses, it shall that differential, meaning whatever discount they're giving the homeowners off of the first year actual numbers, if they do that, they shall subsidize that difference and they shall pay that difference no less frequently than the unit owners, which means monthly, or however, whatever is called for in the documents. And if that doesn't happen, it must be fully paid by the end of the year.
Ed, before you go to the next slide,
Yes.
Just a question, because some people may not be 100% sure what you're talking about. You said if deficit funding is chosen, then all units are subject to their share. Now, of course, it's set up so that the developer creates the budget, and except in certain extraordinary circumstances, if at the end of the year there is a deficit, because perhaps the developer, whether intentionally or unintentionally, ended up misjudging what the costs might be, who pays for that at the end of the year?
That would be the developer.
Right.
That covers that. And part of that can come from the developer not estimating the correct number of units when he's doing his initial budget. And we'll get to that in a minute.
Thank you.
Thanks for clarifying that. Next, so if there is a deficit for the year based upon all of what's happened, we've budgeted, everybody's paid their appropriate share, and there's a deficit, still a deficit at the end of the year because, again, maybe units didn't close as the developer had expected. The developer has 60 days from the start of the new year to pay it. Deficits for reasons unforeseen and beyond the control of the developer, except with an allowance for 3% of bad debts, working capital may be used. But let's not jump so quickly on that. In the event there's an immediate need for something and it can't wait until or working capital isn't available, special assessment may be imposed. And that means all units, developer and unit owner units. If the working capital is used for one of these unforeseen or beyond the control of the developer circumstances, the use of the working capital must be approved in an open meeting. Going on to surpluses, and there's a lot here, so I'm kind of going quickly because there's a lot to absorb, but in the event there's a surplus at the end of the year, it will be allocated proportionally to how it was assessed. So again, the developer is paying on their units, and the unit owners are paying on their units, and at the end of the year, if there's a surplus, it's going to get allocated back to both groups in proportion to how they paid it in. So the developer does get some back if, in fact, some of those unoccupied units caused there to be a surplus. It can be a refund or a credit to everyone. The disposition of the surplus is based upon a vote of all the unit owners except the developer. And if there's no quorum of unit owners, then the board decides. The final determination of the surplus or deficit will be made at the time of the audit, meaning the amount of the surplus or deficit will be confirmed at the time of the audit. So any deficits by unforeseen or unanticipated events, the board shall modify the budget if it causes a material change. And that's the developer controlled board as well as subsequent to that, but the developer must see to that happens. If the budget's being used is a full occupancy budget, then the registration must be amended within 30 days. So if there is a material change to the budget, the budget in the POS must be amended within 30 days. A copy of the revised budget, other than the full occupancy budget, must be issued before the start of a new year. So if there's a revised budget for the upcoming year, it must be issued 30 days before the start of the new year. If upon audit a deficit is different than originally determined, the developer shall be refunded the difference if one is called for. So if the deficit ends up being less than what was initially calculated before the audit and the developer overfunded the deficit, they can have that portion refunded to them. Within 60 days prior to the new year, the developer must provide a schedule of estimated closings. Now, this goes into the process of the developer preparing a budget at the start of or prior to the start of every year. So within 60 days, the developer provides an estimate of closings they anticipate, including common elements and facilities that will be in place in the coming year. And then while under developer control, the developer shall prepare an actual budget based upon the estimated units for the following year. That budget must also include a 3% line item to account for potentially assessments that become unpaid. As to working capital is assessed as called for in the documents. Can't be more than 9 months worth of the monthly fee. And while under the developer control, segregated in a separate account with FDIC insurance and a bank registered in New Jersey. Have to be careful about that to make sure the developer complies with that. Now, that working capital can be used for one-time startup expenses. For example, putting office equipment in the management office, or utility deposits, or insurance prepayments. There are types of things that need working capital cash up front before the assessments are collected or fully collected. So this gives the association the opportunity to use the working capital to cover that cash shortfall. And it may be used for unanticipated or unexpected expenses in lieu of a special assessment. And I mentioned before the way that would work. It's not for capital, it can't be used for capital improvements, customary expenses, meaning the ones you typically see in the budget, for reserves, for repair of construction defects or variances resulting from differences between the actual and the closed units. And this is while under developer control. And the developer can't use it in any way to reduce its funding requirement under any one of the scenarios that we looked at earlier. Some of the old rules that are still in effect, prior to the closing, the developer pays all expenses and reserves for anything that's constructed, or any operating expenses. Any deficit or expense funding by the developer must be disclosed. And an example of this is if the developer is paying something directly, in some cases, the developer will pay the insurance bill directly. That needs to be disclosed to the association. Or the developer is providing security services to the association and paying for it. And the unit owners are looking at their budget and they're assuming, or at their monthly fee, and assuming that included in their monthly fee is security services, but in fact, it's not part of the budget. It's just being provided by the developer. That's an undisclosed subsidy. We can't have that. Any subsidy cannot be used to artificially reduce the maintenance fee unless fully disclosed. The annual audit must be delivered to unit owners within 90 days of year end. That's pretty strictly enforced. And for those developers and management companies, this is something to watch carefully and prioritize. Sometimes it's lost track of in the first year of an association as to when it starts, but it must be 90 days before the year end. We in our practice put all of those jobs at the top of the list to make sure that we meet the 90-day requirement. And then lastly, the developer must post a bond equal to the annual budget, and the second year thereafter, the annual budget plus accumulated reserves. So to wrap up my section, these are my observations of all of this, which is it's now more science than art. It used to be more art than science. Thankfully, there is clarity to the rules under which this will happen and little to be interpreted. it will require careful determination of the funding approach by the developers. Way more attention has to be paid to every year's budget and the funding by the developers as they go along. They can't just set the full occupancy fee and then not look at the project and finances until the time of transition. So there's more responsibility for timely action by the developer. You'll hear more about that in Mitch's presentation. There needs to be more careful monitoring of expenses by boards and making sure all of these happen as well, including making sure the developer is fulfilling their responsibilities. The accounting throughout the year becomes more important. The year-end accounting will be more complex as we figure out what are the surpluses and deficits and how does it get allocated and who's entitled to it. And I put the next line, not to be self-serving, but I expect that because of all this, there may be increased audit fees, not double and triple, but there's more complexity to make sure it's all done right. Hopefully, however, there'll be reduced litigation and expert witness costs. And I can tell you in some of these, because of the range of claims that are made that are unrealistic, it just creates lots of litigation and distraction of the board to manage this, not to mention legal fees, when it was really just to try to inflate numbers and not come to what is a reasonable conclusion that is fair to everyone. So hopefully there'll be reduced litigation, expert witness costs, and then quick and immediate resolution to any possible financial claim related to accounting. It'll all be clear and satisfied and nothing left to interpretation. And that's it.
Before we turn to Mitch, and I just want to announce to everybody that you can post your questions. In fact, we ask that you do so, but we probably will be taking the vast majority of the questions at the end of the program to the extent time permits. But Lisa Vidiello asked one question, and it's one that might be on a number of people's minds, and it directly relates to your presentation. So I want to just put that up for you. Which is, how is working capital handled when there is a surplus? Is surplus determined after working capital is fully exhausted?
I'm not sure exactly of that question.
I'm assuming when Lisa refers to working capital, and this is not a correct assumption, Lisa can further post a question. So does the developer get to use up the working capital contributions before determining whether there's a deficit, which has been an issue in the past? And I know we addressed that in these regulations.
Right. There are very clear parameters under which you can use the working capital while under developer control. It's very specific. It's got to be unforeseen and other expenses not otherwise covered in the budget. So it's clear that it has to be that, and there has to be a vote to use the working capital.
Right.
So those are the safeguards.
This should, at the end of the day, resolve many of the disputes that have occurred over time about whether working capital was properly used or not. And I'll just point out one additional thing that the regulations permit working capital to be used for is in connection with particular startup expenses, like putting in a phone system for the association, or purchasing a copy machine or leasing a copy machine. They can be used for those kind of startup expenses.
So just to finish up on that, to the extent that working capital is properly utilized and there's still a surplus, that would be returnable in under the circumstances that were described. Because I think to do otherwise would be putting all of the unforeseen and unexpected and unanticipated expenses on the shoulder of the developer, like a major hurricane or some significant act for which the developer has no control and shouldn't fully indemnify the association for all the cost of those kind of items.
But to be clear, the developer simply can't use it for deficits which are not the result of unanticipated expenses.
Correct. Correct.
Thank you. All right, Mitch, you're up.
Thank you. I wanted to start off by saying that, you know, when we, the three of us were on the task force for developing these rules, and when the rules came out, we all thought there'd be a great interest in hearing about it. So when we advertised this webinar, just so you know, we've had close to 150 people who have registered for today's webinar. So there's a huge amount of interest. And if you look at the audience that has signed up for it, it's from all different areas. It's developers, it's developers attorneys, it's association managers, association attorneys. So there's a great deal of interest in what we're talking about. The other thing I want to mention is, so that nobody misunderstands it, we have a tendency to use the word sides, developer side, association side. And I just want to put it in context, because when we met the task force, it wasn't really sides. Everybody had the same objectives. It was like a team effort to get to this, because the developers were very clear that based on the rules as they stand now, that they wanted an objective way to prepare budgets. And from the community association, I was about to say side, but the community associations, the CAI representatives, it was very clear that everybody wanted an objective way to review the budgets. So I just want to make sure that we're not, when we say sides, it's not intended to mean that we're confrontational, although it does end up that way a lot. And one of the purposes of these rules is so a lot of this confrontation disappears, which is what both Ed and Dave said. So I just wanted to start out by making that comment. And so what I'm going to be talking about is reserve study disclosures. And now go back what Dave presented in the beginning. I want to show the words, and I'm going to be showing a lot of words as part of my presentation. And what I'm going to try to do is, it's not my intention to read the words, but it's my intention to tell you what they mean, to interpret them. So, but the main word when it comes to reserves is adequate. What does adequate mean? And this lack of definition of the word adequate, as I go through here, and you all know, adds so much confusion to what's going on, because everybody, no matter what side, to use that word, defines adequate in a different way, which leads to a huge amount of confrontation, that because it's not defined. And what the rules do is they really go a long way to define what adequate means. So very, very important. And the problems this has caused is obviously lack of guidance on what adequate means. And when you see it, the word adequate is used to define reserve studies. There's no guidance given on what components should be included. There's no guidance given on who contributes for the components on homes that are built, but no homes are sold. There's no guidance on the need for updating, and updating of reserve studies is critical. And there's no good guidance really on developer obligations. So I'm going to touch on all of these as it deals with reserves. Now, as Dave mentioned, I was very involved, and everybody in the audience is probably pretty much familiar with the National Reserve Study Standards of the Community Associations Institute, which are national standards that were developed for reserve studies. Now, while the rules are not mimicking the National Reserve Study Standards, they are pretty much in sync with them in terms of what the intent is, with some minor variations, which I'm going to talk about. For example, in the rules, it uses the word reserve study. But what is a reserve study? Now, if you look at the standards, the most updated national standards include what's called a preliminary reserve study, which is essentially the same definition. It's a budgetary tool which identifies the components that the association is responsible to maintain and replace, and the funding plan to offset future major common area expenditures. That's essentially what reserve study means in the rule. Now, a preliminary reserve study is something that was just added to the national standards, and a preliminary reserve study, the big difference between that and a regular reserve study that a lot of people are familiar with, is a preliminary reserve study is done prior to construction. So prior to construction means that there's no buildings or site or anything to look at to determine what's there, that everything that's included in this reserve study is based on the architectural and the engineering drawings. So very important to understand that differentiation between that and a regular reserve study. The reserve study is made up of two parts. A lot of you have seen this. The physical analysis, which really just lists the components, the quantities, the cost, the replacement cost, and useful lives. Very straightforward. Currently, the rule do not say what components to include. Now, when you're talking about an adequate study, one person's interpreting it one way, another person's interpreting it the other way. But now you'll see as I go through the new rules that it's very clear in terms of what components should be included. Second thing is the financial analysis. You'll see in a few minutes, it's really just a matter of taking the schedule I just showed you and turning it into a cash flow projection. Very important, as you'll see in a few minutes, when you come to a determination of what does adequate mean. So these are the two parts of it. Some other terminology used in the new rule, new reserve study. You'll see that in the rules. And by the way, if anybody wants a copy of the rules, we'd be happy to send it to you. But new rule, new reserve study. In the standards, the same thing. What it means is an update of the current reserve study. There's two types of update, one with a site visit, one without a site visit. But that's the definition essentially of new reserve study in the rule. Adequate reserve funds. Adequate, the key word that we're going to talk about a lot is that based on the National Reserve Study standards, it's what's called baseline funding. So that's their equivalent, but there's a difference, is that when we prepared this in terms of adequacy, we've actually taken it a little step further, which I'll talk about, is that it's adequate per the baseline study that CAI talks about, but irrespective of the age of a component, which I'll talk about, it has to include the roofs. So the national standards do not include that, but the rules that we have do include that. Irrespective of age, useful life, roofs need to be included. All right, it goes into, and again, there's a lot of words. I'm going to concentrate on what does it mean at the bottom. Assessment for common expenses, assessment of common expenses. These are the written words in the rule. But what does it mean? Let's take as an example a clubhouse that is built before construction and anybody moves in. So the useful life of a roof on a clubhouse starts ticking as soon as construction is complete. So let's say worst case that the clubhouse is built and no units are sold for 6 months or a year or whatever it is. Who pays for that roof in the reserve study until such time that the unit owners do? And it's very clear that the developer is responsible for reserve contributions towards the common area components from the date of installation rather than from the unit owner's takeover. Very clear that that's a requirement. All right, what is adequate reserves? And this is the big one. Let's see, adequate reserves are for repair and replacement of the common elements. So developer budgets must include adequate reserves. Again, that wording is in there. It must include adequate reserves, but now there's a definition of what it is, which I'll get into in a minute. Keep in mind, it also says adequate reserves funds for repair and replacement. So replacement is an easy concept to understand. When it comes time to replace it, you have the money to do it from the reserves. Repair is essentially that as during the life of one of these components, it may require something to be replaced that will still come out of the reserve funds, but it's not a 100% replacement of the component. So that's what the intent is for repair and replacement. And the repair and replacement terminology also is in the CAI national standards with essentially the same intent. Now, adequate, the key word here, adequate, what does it mean? And here are the words above, but it summarizes it as saying that you have the money to replace the components without the need for a special assessment or loans, which essentially means that over the period of the reserve of the components, that you won't have to have, if you use the reserve study that's provided, you will not have to have a special assessment to the homeowners or to borrow money to replace one of the components. So keywords, without the need for special assessments or loan, is essentially the definition of what adequacy now means in the rules, which I'll show you what it looks like, because I'm an engineer, I need to show pictures. But it's without the need for special assessments or loan. This is based on a 30-year cash flow projection. If you see the bottom line, it says what items, again, should be included in the reserve schedule. Before it didn't define them, now it says for common elements and facilities with a useful life or remaining years of use up to and including 30 years, and for roofs regardless of their age. So it means that your common element components that will require replacement, 100% replacement, within 30 years or less should be on the reserve study for major components. But if a roof has a useful life of 40 years, it should still be in the study, irrespective of that 30-year rule. So it's based on a 30-year cash flow projection. And again, it's based on components with a useful life of 30 years or less, except for the roofs. So now I see Dave's got a question, but now it's very, very clear about what components should be there. It's not using just the word adequate. Dave, I saw you were ready to, no? Okay.
No, please go ahead, Mitch.
Okay. Now, so what does it look like? I mean, a picture tells 1,000 words to me. I mean, here you've got a chart that shows on the bottom years, and on the left it says cost. So what you're seeing here is a number of different components with different useful lives. And I think you could see my pointer, but this component here has a replacement cost of $12,000, a useful life about 10 years. So you accumulate the money, you replace it, accumulate money, replace it, accumulate money, replace it. So here it's showing many different components with different useful lives and replacement costs, just to show you the concept of what the components are. Now, keep in mind that all of these components have a useful life of 30 years or less, but if it's a roof, it'll extend out further. So now what does adequacy mean? You take all those components together, you add them together into one cash flow line, like this one, and as long as it doesn't drop at its lowest point below zero into a deficit, and you don't have to have a special assessment or borrow money, then this is the definition of adequate.
So Mitch, let me just throw out a question, and if you're going to get to this later in the presentation, just say so. You know, some components are complex, whether we're talking about a sewer pumping station or we're talking about a boiler in a high-rise building. What if certain parts of that component might wear out at different times? Would the engineer have to, under these requirements, have separate line items for those different components?
That's a great question, and it goes back to my definition prior to repairs. I mean, for example, if you have a boiler and you put in $100,000, you may need to replace a pump on that boiler after 10 years, but the boiler lasts 25 years. So there's two ways to look at it. So there's actually two ways to put it on the study, but they're giving you the same answer. One is to say, okay, the $100,000 includes the pumps and everything included within that boiler, but you need to take some money out of it before 100% replacement, which goes back to the term repair. And the other way to do it is to break it down so that every single component of that boiler is a separate line item. My experience has been that in most instances, it's the total lump sum cost of that boiler, using that as an example, and that's why the repair definition is very important to this, because it includes components of the whole. Does that answer the question?
So it does, and I appreciate that. But it's important that everybody on the presentation understand that a developer cannot use reserves unless to fix something while it is in control of the association until 90% of the useful life of the item being fixed has been exhausted. So to use your example of the boiler with the pump, so if it has a 25-year life, if the developer's engineer does not specify the components, there could be an argument with the association about whether the replacement of that pump was after expiration of 90% of the useful life of the boiler.
A good point. I think that's my next slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's right, but it's a good point.
Can I just jump in? Maybe this is a question for Dave, but there's a requirement to include roofs. Suppose you're in an association where the documents define the roofs as the homeowner's responsibility, not the condo's responsibility.
If it's not the association's responsibility, then it does not need to be included in the reserves. And I apologize because I was checking questions as Mitch was speaking, but if he didn't mention this, the reserve standards only require those items that have a life of 30 years or less, except roofs. So if the developer puts in a roof that has a 35 or 40-year life, they still have to start reserving for it from day one.
Yeah, and along those lines, I will tell you, I've seen reserves from all different areas, from all different directions. And some people in the past have been very creative about this, because I remember I saw a reserve study in a governing documents a number of years ago, where in the description it said, this reserve study includes all components with a useful life of 20 years or less. And the question then, which gets you into this confrontational situation, is that, okay, they actually did leave out the roofs because there was a shingle roof with a 25-year life, but they said right here, it says 20 years or less. So not to go in with what happened with that, but that's an example of why these definitions will make it a much more objective presentation and ability to review. But I'll also say that my experience has been that most of the time the problems with reserve studies is because the word adequate clearly, but in the past, it was a lot of times that unqualified people were preparing reserve studies that didn't know what they were, which I'm going to also touch on in a minute.
So, Mitch, I just want to point out we have 5 minutes left till the hour is up.
Okay.
We'll try to stay on to take questions for those who are interested in still participating in this. So I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, no problem. So next topic is that this was never required now. Now there is a requirement that a letter of adequacy be prepared for just the reserve study, not the overall budget. And the other thing is that this letter of adequacy needs to be prepared by a professional engineer or a licensed architect, the same with the reserve study. So keep in mind that CAI has a national designation, the reserve specialist, but a reserve specialist cannot do this for the governing documents unless they're also a licensed engineer or a licensed architect, because the requirements now include that and the letter of adequacy. Going back to what Dave said before, it says so that the money can't be spent for other things is that you can't replace anything out of the reserve study funding until it's 90% of his life is used up. Keep in mind, first of all, that hopefully with the transition period from beginning to turnover, it's going to be much less than the 90%, so it won't happen. But when you get to the item, for example, of the boilers, which Dave mentioned, you're probably going to start seeing that, at least for the POS reserve studies, as I call them, maybe a little more definition in terms of like a pump on a boiler and that type of thing because of that. But the 90% rule, I doubt if you're going to, it's just to prevent people from using things that are not intended, because most of the things, the 90% is way after the turnover takes place. Let's see, fully funded. I just want to mention this. There's a term used in the rule that says that the reserve account has been fully funded in accordance with the association budget. As most people know, there's a term in the national standards that says full funding, totally different. I don't want you to think fully funded means full funding. And that's a full seminar. Again, updates, very important. There was no requirements in terms of updates. Now, essentially, the reserve study needs to be updated when new phases are put in, anytime the as-built construction does not match the drawings, so the common elements are different from what are shown in the original drawings that the preliminary study was based on. And there are certain requirements now that it must be updated to reflect the common elements and what's going to be built that has not been built. I won't go into a lot of detail of that. If the design plans change, the reserve study needs to be updated if that reflects a change in the common elements that are included within the reserve study. Keep in mind, all these updates, it's very clear, are paid for by the developer. It says good faith estimates in the budget. Keep in mind that a reserve study is a budget. It's a budgetary tool. It's not meant to be actual costs, and they never match ever. It's a budgetary tool, and it's a good faith estimate of the replacement costs. And the other thing it mentions that the replacement costs should include not only the hard cost of construction, but includes demolition, removal, and other costs related to the repair or replacement. So that would mean that if you have a roof or something very extensive that may need engineering services, not to be self-promotional, but again, like Ed was, but it should include engineering fees and other fees associated with making the replacement. It's not just a hard cost, it would include some soft costs. So in summary, the reserve study should include all components with a useful life of 30 years or less, except for roofs. Provide funding so that there's no need for a special assessment or loan, never a deficit. Prepared by a licensed engineer or architect with a letter of adequacy. And it should be updated at a minimum if there's an expansion of the community with additional common elements. The common elements were expanded during construction, even if the drawings weren't changed, where the common elements don't match the plans. And in all cases, under developer control, the updates are to initiated by and paid for by the developer. how did I do with 20 slides in my last 4 minutes? so that's my presentation. As you all know, you're all going to receive a copy of these PowerPoints.
Thanks, Mitch, and you did great. And I'm going to okay. So I'm going to scroll down to the end here, and we're going to go through some questions now with regard to this. And I'd like to start with a question asked by Steve Brumfeld, and it's for you, Mitch, and that is, what happens when something has a life of 75 years, say it's a retaining wall or a head wall in a detention basin or whatever it might be? What happens in the reserves with regard to something like that?
That is a great question, because most people miss this concept, and it's very important that if we're using a 30-year time frame, as the association gets older, which usually gets past turnover, but using the retaining wall as an example, as that component that needs to be replaced starts falling within that 30-year projection, let's say an association now is 40 years old. Now, when the reserve stays updated, it goes out to 70 years. If it's 45 years, it goes out to 75 years, and the retaining wall should be then added, which is the standard. Most people, when they do updates for studies, update it based on the old study and don't look at adding something such as exactly what Stephen mentioned. So it's a great point, but that's how it's done, which means typically the useful life is amortized over 30 years, irrespective of the age, except for the roofs.
So Mitch, just further to that point, isn't it possible that on a large project that will be built out over a period of years, that initially some elements might be more than 30 years old, but as the project ages, and depending on market and so on, it may take 10 years to sell out a really large project. What happens when some of those fall under the 30-year life while the developer is still in control of the association?
Absolutely, that if it starts falling within that, let's say it's a 35-year component and it's 6 years old and not turnover yet, those components that now fall within that 30-year window should be added to the study as part of the updates.
Thank you. So one question that I saw that I'll just deal with in case anybody else is wondering is one board member said, well, what impact does this have for an association that's out of transition? Do these requirements, do these rules, i.e. Reserve accounting and so on, do they apply? And the answer is no. These are in connection with a developer's registration of a project and the type of budget that has to be presented and what activities, while the developer is in control of the association, the developer must follow. Once the turnover of control occurs, then the association is back to what are best practices, we would hope, and will follow reasonable standards and will follow their auditors and accountants' advice with respect to appropriate budgeting. But the strict rules that we're talking about here does not apply.
Dave, if I can make a comment along those lines.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows that many states across the country, and more all the time, are starting to have statutory requirements for associations to have reserves and updated. For example, California, Florida, the state of Washington, Hawaii, and a lot of them have statutory requirements now. Who knows if that's going to happen in New Jersey, but it is happening across the country.
Right. So Ed Guttenplan, Ed San George asked a question. He said, regarding, well, maybe it's for both of you, regarding reserve funding before first closing, who monitors dates of installation, calculation of amount, and bill the sponsor? Such items, clubhouse, roof on high rise that could take 2 years to fully build, HVAC being installed and used in high rise during construction, sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera. Does anybody want to comment on that? Ed, you're muted.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to comment.
Well, I think Mitch is probably the expert on it. I think it's like what happens once you start, once first using unit closes. It's whatever documentation is appropriate for that item, whether it's CO dates or completion of the construction, that would normally be obtained. But it'll be complicated for sure.
Yeah, I mean, look, from a legal point of view, the rules are clear that before the sale of the first unit, the developer is 100% responsible for all of the expenses. I guess, so that answers that part of the question. You know, Ed's second part is, well, how do we know timing? And Ed Guttenplan, you certainly suggested an appropriate answer to that, which is, you know, it'll have to be tracked. And, you know, it's going to be reasonable for an association to ask the developer, well, when were these components completed? When did you make your last payment to the subcontractor, for instance, for the work they did on the roof on a high-rise building? When was that requisition put into you because the roof was finished at that point? So, I mean, those kind of things we will still have to deal with, but the rule is that the developer has to pay for the reserves starting with the completion of those items, and then shares that obligation as units are sold.
And Dave, going back to the, I guess I'll call it the confrontational issue, that's, you know, they're developers, we've been involved in this on the association, for associations, in regards to coming up with whether or not the developer's reserve study was adequate. And typically we'll ask for when were things built, because it's going to have an impact on what what it means. And developers typically have when is a building completed, and can provide documentation for that.
So Mitch, while we're on you, Debbie Gregg asks, do these rules change your standard preparation of reserve studies for associations that are out of transition?
Not really, but what it does is it takes some of the standards that firms like mine use and now apply them to these type of reserve studies. But the way that you do it is generally going to be the same. I mean, it's just that we're now being able to use standards for these reserve studies.
So Mitch, can I, just to clarify that, the developers are responsible for baseline funding in the reserve study. Thereafter, the association could choose the full funding approach and change its methodology, correct?
Absolutely.
If they want to.
If the developer chooses baseline, absolutely, which is adequate, I'll call it the same thing. There's no reason why you can't change funding methodologies. Most associations use what's known as threshold funding, without going into a whole seminar on that. But yeah, absolutely, they could change it.
So Donna Peskin asks an interesting question, and I think she's talking about a project that was already started. And her question is this: if the developer is still in control and has previously used the working capital to reduce deficit funding, is there any impact, I assume she means from these regulations? I understand going forward, they will have to abide by the updated rules. So this was actually the subject of a discussion yesterday, Donna, by the builders and CAI. And we're hoping to make one comment that we hope to make to the DCA, which will be due by August the 14th, is that with regard to projects to which phases will be added, we agree that the DCA needs to have phase-in rules that tells us how to deal with those issues. And generally speaking, I believe it is the common understanding of everybody that as you add phases, those phases are going to have to comply with the new rules. So if you had a situation where the developer legitimately used the working capital, and I say legitimately, because sometimes developers have not used the working capital legitimately. But assuming they used it legitimately before these rules become final, there's not much these regulations are going to do to change that. But as they can collect new working capital contributions from new purchasers, this will apply to them. One other question that I'll just quickly answer came from Richard Friedman, which was, does anybody know of any situation where an association actually successfully recovered in litigation underfunding of reserves? And I will indicate the answer is yes. And you know, most transition cases are settled, so often it's by way of a settlement, but there have been instances where a case has gone to trial and an association was able to recover for underfunding. Our hope is that under these new regulations, this will be a much less frequent issue, because even if the allegation is that the developer didn't properly handle the association's funds, it'll be pretty clear under these rules whether it was appropriate or not, and hopefully would quickly result in a resolution of that issue.
Which absolutely, Dave, is absolutely a problem. And from a risk perspective, I'll be quite honest, in the past, we have done reserve studies for governing documents. Based on the current standards, we will not do them. Because of exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, no, and understandable. It is difficult for engineers because, of course, if there's litigation, transition litigation, there's a shotgun approach to bring everybody into the suit and hopefully to have the insurance companies participate in settlement. So understood. I guess we'll take one or two more questions because we're now at 10:40, and anybody else who asks them, we'll do our best. We will be providing a copy of this presentation, both the video link and the PowerPoint presentation, to everybody who participated or who registered initially. So be assured that you will get that.
Dave, there's an anonymous question that I think you posted. It says, do soft costs include attorney's fees?
Well, if he means, is that a startup expense, not the developer's costs to create the association. That's part of the developer's obligation to have an association project. So whether it's a condominium or a planned unit development, the developer would have to pay those attorney's fees. However, attorney's fees that might be anticipated while the developer is in control of the association, such as collection fees, which, certainly there would be at least some attorney's fees in the early years of the association. Those should be part of the budget. So those wouldn't be coming out of working capital. Those would be part of what should be included in the budget.
I think the intent was when I mentioned soft costs for engineering, for replacement costs, like engineering fees.
Well, okay, fair enough. Well, that does raise an interesting question. Maybe Ed, you can answer this. So as the developer is required to update the reserve study, do you have an opinion under these regulations who should be responsible for those costs of updating?
Under the regulations, the developer is responsible for funding it.
Right.
I did want to ask one, and it's sort of a subtlety, but I think the regulations say an independent licensed architect or engineer.
It does.
So that means the developer can't use their own engineer to expedite the preparation of the study.
That's a great point, yes.
And I know, to the relief of managers who manage new projects, the developer can't use the manager to create the reserve amounts, which I know many managers would prefer not to have to do.
And if I could recommend, managers should not do it, because I've seen litigation in transition where managers are pulled in for underfunding and reserves, and the number one thing is, are you qualified to even do the study?
Yep. Exactly right. So I think we've pretty much handled what we can within the time allotted. I want to thank everybody. I hope you got something valuable out of this presentation. I want to thank Mitch and Ed for great presentations. I think they took a fairly complicated subject and made it as understandable as possible. And I thank everybody for participating in today's program. So on behalf of all, thank you and have a great day.